we're going to be taking a look today at the Elves in the D&D 2024 Player's Handbook, and we're going to go through who they are, what their traits are mechanically to express who they are, and then we're also going to go through a series of questions that I've put together that can help you to really roleplay your elves in a way that makes them stand out from, shall we say, bog standard humans. So let's get into it, shall we? So first of all, looking at the narrative and lore, who are the elves according to what the 2024 Player's Handbook tells us? First of all, they were created by the god Corellon, and they initially actually could change their forms at will. They had a shape-shifting ability in their early years. However, the elves eventually lost their shape-shifting ability after they started plotting with Lolth, who, if you're not familiar, is the evil drow goddess, also known as the Spider Queen. She plotted to defeat Corellon with some of the elves, and so Corellon then cursed the elves for the betrayal, causing them, of course, to lose that shape-shifting ability that we've just mentioned. Lolth herself was cast into the abyss after failing to usurp Corellon, and most elves at that point then renounced Lolth and earned Corellon's forgiveness. Corellon being the kind of patron god, of course, of all elves, with Lolth being more of a trickster goddess or demon. Most of the elves renounced Lolth, so Corellon forgave them, but she refused to give back that shape-shifting ability. That was lost forever. Without their shape-shifting ability, the elves then retreated into the Feywild, which is one of the planes which is very closely linked to the material plane. It is the one where fairies and other such creatures, those Fey creatures, hang out, or where they're from. But the Feywild, whilst they were there, only really deepened the sorrow that they had for everything that had happened thus far. But eventually, they were curious enough to spread their proverbial wings and leave the Feywild and start exploring some of the other planes of the multiverse, including the material plane, which is the physical plane that we all exist in, ourselves, as humans of the real world. So what are their physical traits? They have these pointy ears that they are famous for. They don't have any facial or body hair. And they live to around 750 years old. And also, they don't need to sleep. They actually instead enter this meditative trance to rest. But unlike humans and most other creatures when they sleep, being unaware of their surroundings, elves remain constantly aware of what's going on around them. Now, the environment itself has actually transformed elves after a millennium, after 1,000 years, granting them these unique magical traits. So the elves themselves, because they have shape-shifting ability, part of the environment has created a pseudo-evolution with some of the elves, which has then created these sub-races or subspecies of elves, which have been influenced by the environment, which we will get to in a moment. But the subtypes in particular that are featured in the 2024 Player's Handbook are the Drow, the High Elves, and the Wood Elves. So the Drow typically dwell in the Underdark, which is the subterranean realm of many lands of the multiverse, most famously the Forgotten Realms or Faerun. And they have been shaped by that environment, of course, living in the dark, where there are some very strange creatures. In some settings, such as Eberron, Drow actually live elsewhere. They're not subterranean, but they might live somewhere like rainforests or ruins, as in the Eberron setting. High Elves have actually been infused with magic from crossing between the Feywild and the material plane. High Elves are also known as Sun or Moon Elves in the Forgotten Realms, and Sylvanesti and Quellenesti in Dragonlance, and Aerini in Eberron. And then there are the Wood Elves, who carry the magic of primeval forests. They obviously often live in woodland areas, known by names like Wild Elves, Green Elves, and Forest Elves, or, in particular settings, the Grugach in Greyhawk, the Kaganesti in Dragonlance, and the Ternadal in Eberron. Now we'll have a look at the actual elf traits. These are the things that represent the elves mechanically. We know who they are, so how are these things represented in the actual rules themselves? They are classified as humanoids, as all of the Player's Handbook creatures are, and they are medium in size. They stand at about 5 to 6 foot tall on average, with a speed of 30 feet, which matches, again, most of the... They also have dark vision, so they can see in the dark, albeit in sort of grayscale, black and white, but they can see in pitch darkness, and also they can see in dim light, as if it were daylight. And they have that up to a range of 60 feet, so they can see in the dark up to 60 feet away from them. They also have their Elven lineage. Again, we have these different types of elves, the Drow, the High Elves, the Wood Elves, and you get to actually choose which type of elf you are when you create your character. You choose a lineage from the Elven lineage table, which we'll come to in a moment, and you gain the level 1 benefit of that lineage when you create your character. And when you reach character levels 3 and 5, you also learn some higher level spells, which are also presented on that table, which you always have prepared. So that means, for those that are not familiar with spellcasting, that means that spell is always available to you to cast, provided that you haven't yet cast it that day anyway. So you can cast it once without using a spell slot, which is quite crucial in the 2024 rules in terms of, as well, being able to cast multiple spells on a turn. You can only use one spell slot a turn, but because with casting these spells you won't have used a spell slot, that means you could cast this spell and another spell as well, provided you had the actions to do. And you also then regain the ability to cast that particular spell in that particular way when you have finished a long rest. So when you have gone to sleep, or in this case as an elf, taken your trance. So you can also cast the spell using any of the spell slots that you have of the appropriate level. So if you are a spellcaster with access to spell slots, you can cast that spell multiple times because you always have it prepared. And intelligence, wisdom, or charisma will be your spellcasting ability for the spells that you cast with the trait. You get to choose which one of those, whether it's intelligence, wisdom, or charisma, when you... So you also have Fey Ancestry, which means that you have advantage, meaning you get to roll 2d20 and take the highest result on saving throws that you make to avoid or end the charmed condition specifically. So it's much harder to charm an elf because you are of a Fey background. You also have Keen Senses, which means you automatically gain proficiency in Insight, Perception, or Survival as skills, which means that you are innately better at those particular skills. You get a proficiency bonus to those skills, which at first level will be +2 to those rolls, just by virtue of the fact of being an elf. You also have the trance. So we touched on this in some of the lore, but elves don't need to sleep, and magic equally can't actually put an elf to sleep. So they're not going to fall victim to a sleep spell, for example. And you can finish a long rest in 4 hours, as opposed to the standard 8, if you spend those hours in a trance-like meditation, during which time you retain your consciousness. So you only need 4 hours. Everybody else is going to have to sleep for 8, but you only need 4 hours, and you are aware. So elves are very good for keeping watch at night to make sure that those pesky long rests don't get interrupted. We're looking at the Drow lineage features. So this is part of the elf lineage table that was referred to earlier. It's a very simple table that breaks down what you get at level 1, level 3, and level 5 for each of the lineages. So we'll start with the Drow. So your dark vision, which we talked about earlier, which you had 60 feet, now increases to 120 feet. The only other race, as far as I can recall, or species rather, in the 2024 Player's Handbook that has dark vision up to this range is dwarves. So Drow and dwarves are the best at seeing in the dark. And as part of being a Drow, you also know the Dancing Lights cantrip. So this is a spell you can cast as many times as you like a day. You have infinite access to the Dancing Lights cantrip spell. At level 3, you gain Fairy Fire, and also at level 5, you unlock the Darkness spell. And again, these are spells that you have always prepared, and you can cast them at least once a day at no cost. So let's look at Dancing Lights. So this is directly from the 2024 Player's Handbook. It's a cantrip. It's one action to cast to a range of 120 feet, and you need verbal, somatic, and material components. So that means you need to be able to utter the magic words, do the gestures, and also you need material components, which is a bit of phosphorus specifically. Now, if you are not a spellcaster and don't have spellcasting component pouch, or if you don't have an arcane focus, for example, you might be a fighter who has dancing lights. So you might not have those things. You will need that material component because obviously your spell component pouch or arcane focus are non-existent. Or you can get yourself hold of a spell component pouch when you create a character, or go and buy one, and that will then mean that you have that phosphorus that you need at the time. But if you don't have one of those, then you will need a bit of phosphorus to cast this spell. It lasts for a minute. It's an illusion spell. It's no attack or save, and it is for utility purposes. So you get to create up to 4 torch-sized lights within range, making them appear as torches, lanterns, or glowing orbs that hover for the duration. Alternatively, you could combine the 4 lights into one glowing medium form that kind of looks a little bit human. And whichever form you choose, each light sheds a dim light in a 10-foot radius. And as a bonus action, you can then move the lights up to 60 feet to a space within range, but all of the lights must be within 20 feet of another, otherwise that spell vanishes. But also the light vanishes if it exceeds the spell's range as well. So a very useful spell for exploring the dark places of the world, for example, or at least helping your friends to explore the dark places of the world. Fairy Fire, which you unlock at 3rd level, is a 1st level spell. Casting action 1 time, you get to unleash a 20-foot cube within 60 feet of you. This one only requires magic words, so no gestures or material components. Lasts for a minute. It is a concentration spell, which I believe Dancing Lights is 2. So you can only have one of these active, because you need to concentrate on it. It's from the Evocation School, and it requires a dex save if you're targeted by it, and grants a bit of a debuff. Any objects within a 20-foot cube within that 60-foot range are then outlined with a blue, green, or violet light, which you get to choose. Each creature in the cube also is outlined by this glow if it fails that dex saving throw. So for the duration, which is 1 minute, objects and affected creatures actually shed dim light in a 10-foot radius. And crucially, because they are now shedding this light and they're surrounded by this outline of light, they actually cannot benefit from being invisible because you can clearly see where they are. Attack rolls against an affected creature or object advantage if the attacker can see it. So it makes things easier to hit, Fairy Fire, and also helps you to see things that are otherwise invisible. Very useful. And then at 5th level, you unlock the Darkness spell, which is such a cool spell, which is a 2nd level spell. It's an action to cast. You place it within 60 feet of yourself. It requires verbal components, so magic words, and material components. In this case, bat fur and a piece of coal. If you don't have a spell component pouch or arcane focus, you will need those. It is a concentration spell, so likewise, you still have to concentrate only on this spell. It's an evocation spell, no attack or save against a target, and it's intended to help control the battlefield. So for the duration, magical darkness spreads from a point within range and fills a 15-foot radius sphere. Dark vision can't see through it, and non-magical light can't illuminate it. So it is magical darkness. Alternatively, you can cast a spell on an object that isn't being worn or carried, causing the darkness to fill a 15-foot emanation originating from that object. Covering that object with something opaque, such as a bowl or helm, actually blocks that darkness. And if any of the spell's area actually overlaps with an area of bright light or dim light created by a spell of level 2 or lower, that other spell is dispelled. So actually you can put out magical light if it is weak magical light. Even the light spell will get dispelled completely by coming into contact with the magical darkness. Now let's move on to the High Elf. At level 1, you know the Prestidigitation cantrip we'll come to in a second. Whenever you finish a long rest, you can replace that cantrip with a different cantrip from the wizard's spell list. Nice. At level 3, you unlock Detect Magic, and at level 5, you unlock Misty Step. So Prestidigitation is a cantrip. It's an action to cast. It's 10-foot range, verbal and somatic components, so magic words and gestures. It lasts for an hour. It's not concentration, and it is a transmutation spell. No attack or save needed, and it's for utility purposes. You get to create a magical effect within range, choosing the effect from the options below. And if you cast this spell multiple times, you can have up to 3 of its non-instantaneous effects active at any time. So you can create a sensory effect which is instantaneous and harmless, such as a shower of sparks, a puff of wind, faint musical notes, or an odd smell. You can instantaneously light or snuff out a candle, a torch, or a small campfire. You can clean or soil, instantaneously cleaning or soiling an object no larger than 1 cubic foot. You can create a minor sensation, so you chill, warm, or flavor up to 1 cubic foot of non-living material for 1 hour. You can create a magical mark, so you make a color, small mark, or a symbol appear on an object or a surface for 1 hour. Or minor creation, you can create a minor, non-magical trinket or an illusionary image that can fit in your hand, and it lasts until the end of your next turn. The trinket can deal no damage and actually has no monetary worth, so it stops you from just creating these little magic items and selling them off. For Detect Magic, for those that are not familiar, it's a first level spell. It's an action to cast. You cast it on yourself, and you can see the effects of it up to 30 feet from yourself. It has verbal and somatic components, so again, magic words and gestures. It is a concentration spell that lasts for 10 minutes, and it is from the Divination School. It helps you to see things in an otherworldly manner. No attack or save is required, and its function is for the purposes of detection. So for the duration, you sense the presence of magical effects within 30 feet of yourself. If you sense such effects, you can take the magic action, so you do have to take an action after you've cast the spell, to see a faint aura around any visible creature or object in the area that bears the magic, and if an effect was created by a spell, you learn the spell's school of magic. To clarify then, so it takes you an action to cast the spell, and as you're looking around during that 10 minutes, if you see something that, or sense something rather, that has an effect, you have to take the magic action to really focus in on what that aura, what that magical effect is giving off in terms of what aura that is, which will tell you what school of magic is required. The spell is blocked by 1 foot of stone, dirt, or wood, an inch of metal, or a thin sheet of lead. So you can't, your senses, your detect magic sense will not work through those materials of that particular thickness. So then there is also Misty Step, which you will have unlocked at level 5, which is a 2nd level spell, a bonus action to cast. You can cast it on yourself only, and it only requires magic words. It's instantaneous from the School of Conjuration, no attack or save required, and its purpose is for teleportation. And you briefly surround yourself by silvery mist and then teleport up to 30 feet to an unoccupied space that you can see, crucially. Nice. So then finally, the Wood Elf Lineage. At level 1, your speed increases to 35 feet, so you get a 5-foot bonus, which puts you at the same speed as a Goliath. And you also know the Druidcraft cantrip. At level 3, you unlock Longstrider, and at level 5, you unlock Pass Without Trace, which is an awesome spell also. Druidcraft then. This is a little bit like the druidic version of Prestidigitation. It's a cantrip. It's 1 action to cast, up to a range of 30 feet. It's a verbal and somatic component, so again, magic words or gestures, or rather magic words and magical gestures. It's instantaneous from the School of Transmutation, no attack or save required, and it is for the purposes of utility. Whispering to the spirits of nature, you create one of the following effects within range. Weather Sensor, you can create a tiny, harmless sensory effect that predicts what the weather will be like at your location for the next 24 hours. This might manifest as a golden orb for clear skies, a cloud for rain, falling snowflakes for snow, and so on. And the effect persists for 1 round. You can instead use the Bloom feature, where you can instantly make a flower blossom, a seed pod open, or a leaf bud bloom. You can create a harmless sensory effect, such as falling leaves, spectral dancing fairies, a gentle breeze, the sound of an animal, or the faint odour of a skunk, and the effect must fit in a 5-foot cube. Or you can do Fireplay, which, much like Prestidigitation, allows you to light or snuff out a candle, torch, or a campfire. Interestingly, the Druidcraft one doesn't explicitly state a small campfire, it only explicitly states a campfire. So presumably a campfire of any size, which makes Druidcraft's version of Fireplay slightly more powerful. Whether that was deliberate, I don't know. So Longstrider, which as a Wood Elf you unlock at level 3, is a 1st level spell, is an action to cast, it's a touch, target, which requires verbal, somatic, and material components, magic words, magical gestures, and a material component, which is a pinch of dirt. So presumably if you're outside, you'll be able to cast this without having to need a component pouch, for example. It lasts for an hour. It is from the Transmutation School, no attack or save required, and it is a buff. So you touch a creature. The target speed increases by 10 feet until the spell ends. And actually, if you were to use a higher level spell slot, you can actually target one additional creature for each spell slot level above 1. So yeah, so a level 2 version of Longstrider, for example, you'd be able to touch 2 creatures to increase their speed by 10. Very useful. Not concentration required either, so that will increase their speed for an hour. Very handy in a tight spot. And then Pass Without Trace, which is a very good spell. It's a 2nd level spell. You will unlock it, of course, as a Wood Elf at level 5. It takes an action to cast. You can cast it on yourself. It creates an emanation, an aura of 30 feet. It requires magic words, magical gestures, and material components. In this case, ashes from burned mistletoe, specifically. Unless, of course, you have a component pouch or casting focus. It's a concentration spell, and it can last for up to an hour. From the Abjuration School, no attack or save required, and this is also a buff. So you radiate a concealing aura in a 30-foot emanation for the duration, and while in the aura, you and each creature you choose have a plus bonus to dexterity stealth checks and leave no tracks. Very good for dungeon crawling and trying to get past some guards that you need to pass by. And those are all of the mechanical benefits. Elves are one of the more complicated races in the 2024 Player's Handbook. So now I want to go through a number of questions that you can ask yourself about your character when creating an elf to really bring out the roleplay elements of the elf so that they don't just feel like a human with pointy ears. So these are some questions that you can ask to really bring the roleplay aspect out of being an elf. First of all, what is your connection to Corellon and the ancient elven history? Corellon is that patron god of elves that we talked about. This was the one that nearly got usurped by Lolth. Does your character feel the weight of the loss of the shape-shifting ability that their ancestors from 1,000 years ago had? Or are they more focused on their present existence? They might not even be aware of it. They might not even necessarily care that deeply about the ancient history of the elves. How does your longer lifespan, again, elves live to about 750 years old, how does that long lifespan shape your perspective on time and relationships? Living for centuries, for example, might affect how you look at events and interact with shorter-lived species or races. Do you view them with compassion? Do you view them with detachment or even curiosity? Do you study races or species that don't live for as long? Or do you just keep yourself detached from them because perhaps you don't want to get too close to any individuals that you know that probably in 100 years' time, when you are 350 and still have another 400 years to live, that in 100 years' time, this individual that you've spoken to will no longer exist? An interesting question, I think, when it comes to the species that are not elves. What are your thoughts on the Feywild and its influence on you? Do you feel a deep connection to the fairy realm that is the Feywild and its magic? Or have you distanced yourself? It seems to be a lot of trying to work out with elves, of trying to work out how much you lean into being an elf versus not, which of course is the point of all of these questions. Which lineage of elf are you when you create your character? So which lineage are you, and how has the environment that you're in then shaped your abilities? And I'm not just talking about the mechanical abilities, but also your abilities as an individual character. So whether you're a high elf, wood elf, or drow, how will those surroundings have shaped or influenced your personality and the magic that you use, for example? How does the environment affect your character's choices? For example, if you were a drow, you're probably not going to like being out in the light too much, for example. In fact, mechanically, that was something that existed in previous versions of the drow player race, and indeed the monster. sunlight would not be good for you when you think about the sorts of people that don't spend much time in the daylight. Are they a little recluse, perhaps? Are you maybe somewhat agoraphobic, perhaps, as something to explore, if that's something that interests you to explore at the game table? Do you not like big spaces? Likewise, as a wood elf, maybe the opposite is true. Maybe you love being outdoors so much that you have almost a tentative discomfort with being inside a stone building, for example. And so maybe that affects the way that you go about town if you're in an urban setting, for example. So how does the trance state impact your approach to rest and reflection? So again, unlike other races who have to sleep, your meditation allows you to stay awake. If you're in this meditative state, it is something to think about in terms of what is it, because you're conscious, and humans and other races or species will dream. Presumably, an elf is going to be focusing in, whereas dreams function, we believe, as a way, or some believe, as a way of kind of processing the subconscious. An elf is presumably going to need to do the same thing as part of their trance. So what sort of memories or meditations might your character focus on during their trances? Elves are heavily connected to magic, and so, in fact, all of the elves, as we've just seen, have access to magic on some level, even if they're not a spellcasting class. How does your character perceive and utilize magic, whether that be from nature, Feywild, or other sources? What are their beliefs around magic? What are the rules that they have around magic as an individual, or maybe even if you have been given a little bit of freedom from your dungeon master? How important is magic, and what role does it play? How do you feel about the other Elven subraces? Do you hold, for example, going back to that weight of the sins of the past, does your character hold grudges against the Drow, and maybe even some of the other elves? Is that something that you are interested in exploring at the table, that your other players are interested in exploring at the table, and indeed your dungeon master might be interested in exploring at the table? That's certainly a discussion that you should have with your other players, I think, and dungeon master, to see if everybody's comfortable with that being explored. But so long as everybody at the table is comfortable with that, because of course this history happened about 1,000 years ago. What emotions or experiences have shaped your sense of morality? Elves, again, can live for hundreds of years, so they will have had, presumably, a wider range of experiences than most other species will have had. And in that, has your elf had any particular events that have profoundly impacted their ethics or their worldview, for example? How do you navigate the tension between your long lifespan and the fleetingness of mortal life? Your character's longer lifespan is likely to create some sort of disconnection, as I wrote here, from the struggles and concerns of some of the shorter lived races. Then perhaps not going to understand as much the kind of rush of human ambition, for example. So how does your elf handle those qualities, or that lack of perspective, perhaps? And is that something that you want as core of your character? What is your attitude toward adventure and exploration? Are you an elf, for example, who does actively seek out new experiences on the material plane? Would you rather be somewhere that is secluded and a safe place for you to reflect on the multiverse, or even your own personal life? And how has, if it has at all, curiosity, because we know that the elves became progressively more curious as the centuries went on, how has curiosity shaped your journey, if at all? Because that, again, that might not be something that you wish to explore in your character, which is also fine. Those are the questions on helping you to really get into the headspace of an elf. You can use those questions to really, I hope, inspire some interesting character decisions and character development decisions. Good to have a discussion with your DM on some of those as well, of course, and where appropriate, some of the other players, if there are themes that they are willing to explore. But I've also put together a little sort of worksheet that you can print off, which is going to put some of these questions into text boxes, so you can just do some sort of bullet point ideas to really help you get it from out of your head onto paper so that it really goes in, because apparently there are studies that suggest that writing things down by hand help them go into your brain a little bit better. You can find that in the link below or over on the Patreon at patreon.com/bardicquest. It is available for free, so you don't need to sign up as a paid patron. It is available to people that just want to sign up and support us as free patrons. So that is downloadable there for you. So thank you, my friends, for tuning in as we dived into elves and as we continue to explore the sort of common species of D&D. We have one more of these videos on the common species to do, which is humans, which I'll be recording hopefully rather soon, before we then move into some of the less common species, such as Dragonborn, Aasimar, Tieflings, etc. Thank you for joining me, and I will catch you on the next video.